Welcome to M&A Mondays, the UK's first YouTube series dedicated to all things M&A. From interviews with the leading figures in the industry, to coffee chats with analysts, diversity panels, all the way through to workshops, we'll be covering it all. We do hope you enjoyed the video, and please give us a like and a follow on our social media. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's M&A Monday, the first UK YouTube series dedicated to all things M&A. My name is Nikola, and I'm the head of Speaker Relations, and today I'm joined by Emerald, our Speaker Relations Executive.
Today we're delighted to welcome another speaker for our M&A Monday series, Luka Roje. Luka is currently an associate at Goldman Sachs in London office. He has been working for Goldman Sachs for more than 6 years and has rich experience with a particular focus on the natural resources sector. Before dedicating to the sector, he joined as an analyst in human capital management. He received a master's degree from University of Zagreb, and that was in psychology. And we're very happy to have you here today. So without further ado, let's get started. How are you, Luka?
Not bad, thank you, Emerald and Nikola, and thank you for the invite. Pleasure to be here.
So for the first question, we just wanted to start a bit about your university background. So having studied psychology, what made you decide to take a route into investment bank? And in what way did it put you at an advantage and if disadvantage, if at all?
Yeah, it is a bit of unconventional route, right? When you say psychology, you usually see a couch, not necessarily an Excel model. But essentially, I wanted to do psychology because back in the day, I wasn't sure whether I want to do medicine, that's something that I was considering, or something closer to the economy. And essentially, psychology enabled me to push back my decision, because if I wanted, I could channel myself into the clinical psychologist type of job, or also to go towards the organizational psychology. Eventually, I ended up focusing primarily on the organizational aspect of it, which included psychometrics, statistical analysis, organizational behavior, lots of social psychology and organizational psychology. And essentially, as already at university, I was working in HR and conducting, psychometric testing as part of recruitment processes. And then I decided to, my best friend was in London, so he said, "Oh, there are internships in London, so you can apply for that. You have some experience already." And frankly, when I was applying, I said, "Oh, I might get a free trip to interview in London." All the interviews are over the phone, but I did get an internship, so I did spend 10 weeks at Goldman's in the recruitment team, actually, in HCM, because that was what I was initially applying for. And then I got the full-time offer. I moved for good with my wife in 2015 in London, and I started in the human capital management in the business partner team that covers investment banking. And I spent 3 years there, and it was really great. There's a lot of clearly data available, so you can do a lot of analytics. There's also a lot of process management, which helps you polish your skills. But then what was interesting at that point, we were actually sitting on the floor with bankers, and the more bankers I met, the more I talked to them, the more I heard what they were talking about on the phone, all the fun and interesting things that they did. That sounded quite interesting to me. And then 3 years later, I decided to try to make a move into banking. I would, because I had no financial background whatsoever. I found mentors in banking, so they told me, okay, you don't need to know everything, but you should know what a DCF is, high level, what an M&A process usually looks like, what's an LBO. So essentially, I tried to understand those basic concepts. I found, resources online, and I would spend time after my day job just reading about banking stuff, and eventually I interviewed and made the move in 2018. And since then I've been in the natural resources team, as you mentioned, The great thing about it was I spent 3 years in the back office, so my expectations of what banking will look like were quite realistic. So that was really helpful. The last 3 years have been really amazing, like incredible learning and incredible experience overall. And yes, I sit in natural resources team and primarily focus on the infrastructure subsector, which covers everything from regulated utilities to transportation, a little bit of midstream as well, because more and more the definition of infrastructure has been evolving over time, and it gets broader and broader and overlaps with all sorts of other sectors. So that's like long story short. I really try to keep it short, Chris.
Thank you so much for the detailed answer. And just following from what you said, you started in Goldman Sachs in the HCM team and as an IBD business partner. So I'm sure that the audience is watching this video. Some of them could be also wanting to apply to this role or this particular team. So can you just tell us a bit more about exactly what is involved in the daily job of this role? Just tell us a bit more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially the way you can think about our job is twofold. So depending clearly, as you look at various companies, they will have a different structure. But if you take a really high level picture, the way our division structure of banking here is you have the financing group and the M&A group. So the financing group would be aligned by products. So you would have structured finance, leverage finance, and another. And then the M&A subdivision would be aligned by sectors and countries. So you would have the natural resources, you would have the consumer retail group, healthcare, TMT, etc. And then essentially, when you start, you get into one of those teams. And what we do essentially is you can think of our job twofolds. There are various marketing efforts and there are executions, right? And if you think about, let's assume one single process and evolution of a situation, how it can go. So you start marketing. Let's see, we find out an asset would be going up for sale, right? So we start our marketing efforts then there. First, we start to pitch to be an advisor on the sell side, because both the sell side and the buy side would be could get involved. Essentially, if we get the mandate for the sell side, then we advise the current owner on how to sell the asset, which is good. But then even if we don't get the sell side mandate, we start pitching that as a buy side opportunity. So, and then, for example, let's say that financial sponsors are interested in an asset. So we would go to see various clients and see, okay, I say, really think this asset would be good for your portfolio or for your company because of X, Y, and Z. And let's say one of them says, okay, this sounds good, let's go. We want to have you as a financial advisor. That is when that marketing effort actually turns into execution. We sign an engagement letter and we are, as we say, mandated. And then the process actually kicks off. Throughout that process, you would have us who are the financial advisor, but you could have commercial advisor, technical advisor, tax advisor, legal advisor. So there's a whole team of advisors where essentially we are leading the whole process. We are the ones that would then start building the model and focus primarily on the valuation. Clearly, there's a process management, and the process usually has round 1 and round 2 to take like a vanilla process. So in round 1, we would come up with our model, we would build it, unless it was provided by the sell side. And then we would try to, in agreement with the commercial advisor, technical advisors, we would try to come up with assumptions. So for example, if you're talking about an airport, we would say, okay, we expect the traffic to go up by X and the tariff to go by Y, and that will create the revenue of X. And that's, once you go through all the cash flows, you come up, for example, with the distribution for the sponsor that we are advising. You do a dividend discount, or which is like another form of DCF, and you come up with the valuation and you say, this is the value that you think we think you should be paying, and it makes sense. Clearly, you would then have upside scenario, downside scenario. So you go through a lot of back and forth dancing amongst all each other until we all agree on various assumptions and come up with the value that we're willing to bid for. That's round 1. Then in round 1, you usually submit a non-binding offer. And then let's say there are 20 bidders, the seller will say, okay, out of you 20, 5 of you are actually go through the round 2. In round 2, you would get a much better access to the data. They create what's called a VDR, a virtual data room, where they put all the various documents, and then all the advisors can actually read through their corresponding respective documentation, such as contracts, etc., to come up with an even more refined set of valuation. You would usually also have a management presentation where you get exposure to the management. You would have a site visit where you would go and see what the actual site of the asset looks like. And then you submit what's called the binding offer. And once all the binding offers are submitted, the seller would say, okay, this is the bid that wins. And then when the transaction is announced, a few more legal processes, and then eventually the transaction is closed. So that's in a nutshell. That whole process can take up to a few months. And as you can tell, it's very dynamic because you constantly get new information, something you assumed in the first place, like changes once you've seen the documentation. So you have also the competitiveness, someone might preempt. And so it's very, very dynamic and very, very interesting. And clearly also, the more transaction you work on, the more you learn, because essentially no transaction is the same. This was a very simple one. It could be, something, a private, public to private takeover, or it could be all sorts of transactions. So you constantly are exposed to new things.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. And now just to follow up what you mentioned previously, that you had a chance to actually interact with people working in IBD. Can you expand on that and tell us what was your motivation for transitioning from HCM to IBD, and in what way did Goldman Sachs actually support that transition?
Yeah. So what primarily motivated me is, as I mentioned, even when I was studying psychology, I was gravitating towards the psychometrics and the more quantitative side of it. HCM was amazing, but what I found though is that banking was much more, as you would expect, like much more technical, much more analysis around there. There is, from a technical aspect of it, I thought it was a better platform for me to learn. And then on top of that, just the dynamics of the job is something that I quite like, going to client meetings. And also what I really like about banking is the evolution of your role, right? So when you start, you are a junior and you work in Excel primarily. You build models, you build presentations, so Excel and PowerPoint, to correct myself. You build models, you build presentations. As you evolve to an associate level, for example, you already start working with the analyst. So you need to start building your leadership experience from that point onward. As you move on to a next level, which is the vice president, you already, aside from managing the juniors, you need to start building relationship with clients. Well, hopefully you would have built some already before, but at that point you need to, the salesy element comes in and you need to start, driving the marketing effort. The role becomes more salesy. And then when you get to an MD level, it's a completely different game, right? On top of the salesy part, you also usually assume some team leadership responsibilities, etc. So like, if you look through a career of a banker who goes from the most junior level to the most senior one, it's quite a well-rounded career, and in terms of the skill set that it develops for you. And then it's never the same, right? Because I remember back when you're an analyst, you never reach, so to say, the point when you're like, okay, now I know everything. Now I can chill and just lay back and enjoy my current situation, because it constantly drives you to push your limits. As soon as you're comfortable with the analyst job, people will expect you to start thinking as an associate, so that by the time you become an associate, you're already operating at that level. And same applies, once you get comfortable with your associate role, people will start thinking the same for you to start thinking as a VP. So, and it's like, in terms of learning, there is the biggest learning actually happens when there is some extraordinary situation when you need to assume more responsibility and step up. Like that is the best learning experience that you can get. And that whole being intellectually challenged all the time, and it's something that I found quite appealing, and I still enjoy it.
Thank you so much. And so for the next question, it's a bit more about your insights. So how has the natural resources, and to be more precise, the infrastructure sector been impacted by COVID-19? And what do you think the future holds for this sector?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. You know, one thing that I think we all noticed, if you compare, we've had this crisis, right? But one big difference, if you compare it to the crisis back in 2008, is that the financial system back in the day actually collapsed. At this point, the financial system was operating well. So there was capital in the market. And then if I think about our clients, which are the financial sponsors, they actually had an amazing amount of gunpowder all the time. So you clearly had the businesses that were struggling. But then in terms of our work, first, like it came after, if I remember back, like after the initial shock, you had a lot of financing discussions, right? And like restructuring, how do we go about this? What do we do? And then after that, when the situation a little bit normalized, you had various situations happening. You had, you know, strategic players divesting non-core businesses, and then private equities and pension funds would, you know, acquire them. Or you could see a partnership even between financial sponsors and the strategics for some new business endeavors going forward. You also had, you know, there seemed to be appetite on the financial sponsor side. There seemed to be appetite for restructuring on the strategic side and the corporate side. And I think like over time, we never saw actually a drop in activity. We just saw a certain change of trends. If you think about the sector, clearly in the infrastructure space, the one that's been most talked about and most affected is the transportation, right? But even transportation in itself is quite a broad term. You would see, for example, airports have been massively hit, right? The whole aviation industry has been hit immensely. On the other hand, roads and toll roads have performed reasonably well. And if you think about yourself, right, and all of us, we were unable to jump on a plane and go on holiday. So what did people do? They jumped in a car and then drove to the holiday. So from that perspective, for example, in infrastructure, toll roads have shown to be quite resilient in the whole situation. And then in the aviation sector, you kind of saw it struggling. But then when you look back in 2008 and even before, clearly there was no precedent for something like this historically. But if you looked at the recovery pattern, they recovered fairly well in any previous crisis. The magnitude of this was much better. But what we are seeing currently in Europe is that, if I'm not mistaken, this summer, Europe was at 70% of traffic compared to 2019 per latest reports. But clearly that's a too simplistic view of it, because Greece was much better recovered at, I think, 80% compared to the UK, which was at 50%. So it varies quite a lot from market to market. So I don't think anyone still knows how things are going to evolve and what the recovery pattern will look like. The good thing, I think, is that the sector is slowly getting back to normal. So we'll see what happens.
And now for this question, you mentioned that no transaction is the same, but if you had to choose like a favorite transaction that you have worked on, which one would it be?
Yeah, you know, I thought about this quite a lot, and I think you always remember your first transaction, right? That you ever worked on. For me, it was in the midstream sector, but because if you think about how we covered things, so the oil and gas team would, if you think about oil and gas, you have the upstream, which is when you actually drill the oil from the ground. Then you have the midstream, which is the pipelines. And then you have the downstream, which is petrol stations. So essentially, oil and gas team would do the upstream, infrastructure would do the midstream, and then retail would do the downstream. So we do a lot of these midstream deals. And that was my first. It was like midstream and storage of liquids. And it was super interesting because for me, it was, you know, there are these things with this sector that you don't necessarily think about the supply chain and the value chain of an oil or gas or even water, how it goes from the actual source until your home. But once you start working on infrastructure, you actually get this insight into how things work. So like that midstream transaction was the one that I'll probably never forget, but just because it was my first transaction. Having said that, if I look back on my transaction, all of them had some sort of novelty in them, and all were to a certain extent my first one. That was my first transaction ever. Then I had another transaction where it was my first transaction when we advised the government entity. Then the third one was the first transaction that we took a private company, a public company private. Then another transaction was the first IPO that I did. And that's the thing, I think for the first 3 or 4, even more years, like you will always, most of the transaction will be something completely new. And that's the point. And that's like advice, whoever starts working banking, that's a piece of advice that I would give. Like, try to get as much exposure to all the various different things that you can get, because especially when you work in a rather big bank, like we have a good deal flow, which is the best way you learn. You learn best by actually doing, and try not to silo yourself in a little niche of a sector. Try and explore as much as possible, because that also gives you the skills, your skill set broadens, and you get insight into more sectors. So then you become more valuable, more value additive as a banker, I think, in any situation.
Thank you so much. And it is definitely one of the most attractive points about this industry. And so the next part is, what do you enjoy the most about working for Goldman Sachs? And what differentiates it from other banks?
Okay. Aside from us having an amazing a rooftop garden in our new building, which is something that differentiates it from other banks, but really, and you might think it's a cliche, I think in my experience, what I was fascinated from day one at my internship at Goldman's is the people. And now probably everyone will frown, but just to give you more context in terms of what I mean, like when I was doing internship, my impression that I went away with was that actually every single person that was there that I spoke to was there for a reason, because they were super good at what they were doing. And that was my first impression. These people are actually super intelligent and super interesting, and you actually would enjoy going with them, grab a coffee aside from working. But then the other reason why I think the people are the best thing about the firm is that they're actually willing to support you. If I look back in my career so far for the last 6 years, whatever request I had, whatever in the sense of my wishes, what do I want to do next, etc., I've always had the support from people. When I said I want to start in this team, they made me start in that team. When I said I want to change division, they said no problem. When I said I want take 3 weeks off for my wedding, they said no problem. So things like that, it's all people driven. And I've made, I started in HCM, I'm now in banking, but the whole path of mine, everything I learned would not be possible without someone actually sitting with me and showing me things, especially because I had no context whatsoever when I started doing this job, right? I had no clue. I had no clue what EBITDA was before I started. So like all I have now, my position where I am is, yes, clearly because I was willing, there was motivation on my end, but there were people around me who actually helped me facilitate that. So I think that's quite important. And also, they're fun. It's fun to hang around with them. It's fun. We really enjoy our team socials and like a random day on the floor. So it's really something that it's less about, I think, especially in the first few years, it's less about what you do, like, because I know people are sometimes obsessed with sectors. They're like, I really want to do TMT. I don't want to do natural resources, or I don't want to do consumer. I really want to do whatever. I really think it's less important what you do. It's more important who you do it with, because frankly, and that's another piece of advice, be sector agnostic when you start, because I promise you, whether you work in FIG or NR or consumer retail, over the first few years, the job that you'll actually be doing will be more or less the same. Revenue might be number of tables times the average spend, or number of cars times the average toll price. But once you get to revenue, from then onwards, it's quite similar across the sectors.
Perfect. Thank you very much for
those. And just to caveat one thing also, clearly the firm Goldman gives you opportunities to move around, and like, as you can see by me, but so for the first few years, just do it, don't be stressed out about it. And then after a few years, you'll get a sense and say, okay, this is fun, but actually this is something I think might be really, really interesting. And then, we have rotational programs in place, all sorts of mobilities. It's really easy to move around once you're in your year 2, 3, whatever.
And just to actually touch upon that a bit more, having taken a non-typical path into IBD, showing that you don't have to go spring week, summer internship, full-time position, what advice would you actually give to young people looking to pursue their career in investment banking, and what can they actually expect from this industry?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing, look, first thing, you need to be honest with yourself, and you need to do your homework and research as to what banking really is. And Google is your friend. You have lots of people lots of things that are available there, just and experiences, etc., that can give you a good picture of the industry, of what the work entails. That's one thing. Second thing, go to all the networking events such as this or the live ones, speak to people, get their experiences to get a good picture. Once you are confident that that's what you want to do, then, you know, just prepare yourself for the interviews. You also have resources for that online. Again, speak to people. And if that's what you want to do, that's great. You know, the beauty of banking is that we attract all sorts of backgrounds in a sense. And I mean, from university and skill set. So we have, in terms of universities, yes, we do have some people who are from Oxford, Cambridge, but I'm from a completely non-target university. So, you know, that's not necessarily an obstacle. Then in terms of the backgrounds, we have people who did finance, but we also have engineers. We have, well, I'm a psychologist. We also have another colleague who was a psychologist. So, you know, we have all sorts of backgrounds as well. If you think about my case, you know, I'm a completely non-target university, a random major at university, and I'm still here where I am because I just, you know, I found it interesting. I did some legwork with preparing for the interviews, but essentially if the firm recognizes that you're willing to do it, that you're capable of doing it and motivated, that they're going to give you the chance.
Well, that's it from us. I just want to thank you again for all the brilliant insights, especially with the last answer for people not to be discouraged if they come from a different university background on a non-target university, also for the brilliant natural resources and infrastructure insights. And thank you again. And for our viewers, please do consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel.
Thank you.